Hello, everyone. We've opened up the room just a little early so that everyone can virtually shuffle in and get yourself comfortable. My name is Jenny Parks, and I'll be your host today. I'll repeat these instructions in a moment, but I thought I'll get the first round of them done for all of you. Thank you for being here. Our webinar is the Post-Secondary Outcomes of High School Dual Enrollment Students, a national and state-by-state analysis. And our presenters today, whom I will introduce shortly, are going to give you some great examples of how to use this work and also about some trends that you might observe in the Midwest. Though I know we've got folks from around the nation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being interested in what might be going on in the Midwest with dual enrollment students. So anyway, I wanted to make everyone aware that all of the resources will be available on the MHEC website after the event. We are recording this. Please use the chat to engage with other colleagues who might be on the webinar, but please use the Q&A if you have specific questions for the presenters. I will be, towards the end of the presentation, I will go through those questions and make sure that as many as possible are addressed. And then finally, after we are finished, you will get an email which will give you links and ideas of where to find everything, but it'll also have a short survey. We really appreciate it if you can complete that survey because it helps us know how we did today and how we can do better in the future. So welcome. All right, it is the top of the hour. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Jenny Parks. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, also known as MHEC. Today's webinar is the Post-Secondary Outcomes of High School Dual Enrollment Students, a national and state-by-state analysis. Before I introduce our presenters, let me do a little bit of housekeeping. All the resources will be available on the MHEC website, and yes, we are recording the webinar, so you will be able to access all of that after it's cleaned up and posted. If you would like to engage with others while you are on the webinar, please do so via the chat. If you want to ask questions to the hosts or the presenters, please use the Q&A function. I will make sure to read those, and during our Q&A session toward the end of the presentation, I will go ahead and try to get as many of those addressed verbally as possible. And then finally, you will receive a follow-up email with links to where you can access all the materials. It'll also include a link to a survey. It's very brief, but it lets us know what we did well today and how we can do better in the future. So let's get started. My colleague Mary is there behind the scenes making all the magic happen. Our two presenters today are from the Community College Research Center at Columbia University, and they will be telling you a little bit more about their organization. But we have John Fink, Senior Research Associate and Program Lead, and Tatiana Velasco, Senior Research Associate. But we'll start with John.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Mac. Hey, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. John Fink at CCRC, leading our dual enrollment, transitions research. And on the next slide, I just wanted to sort of start by giving you kind of a sense of what we're working on at CCRC related to dual enrollment. We've been describing and studying an approach to dual enrollment that's really focused on broadening access to college, but also in programs of study that students are excited about and feel that not just push into college, but that pull into college because it taps into their interests and their purpose, and it all sort of starts in high school. And so we describe this, we call it deep dual enrollment equity pathways, and we are sort of kind of conducting this research agenda that's aims at producing guidance for practitioners and policymakers, but also tools and resources, some that my colleague Tatiana will share with you today to help assess and areas for improvement, as well as set goals into the future. So just a couple sort of things that we've done. You can, in this QR code, we have like some of the links, and I'll be sharing some in the chat today as well. But we've been working on studying effective and equitable practices in dual enrollment, which we released in the Dual Enrollment Playbook with the Aspen Institute, as well as follow-up research on the DEEP framework published in 23. We've also partnered with organizations like NACEP and College and the High School Alliance to describe what can state and system leaders do to support practitioners that are really trying to implement this work locally. and we released a report in 2024. We've been also looking at like how are students experiencing these programs and how can we use the student experience and voice to guide our reforms in the improvements that we're making. And then as we're going to present today, we've been looking at just what happens to dual enrollment students after high school. How does that vary by state? And what are their sort of outcomes in the long run? So we've also been developing a set of tools. There's sort of been newer federal data from IPEDS on dual enrollment, as well as data on K-12. So we've just been working on putting more tools and resources out in the field where you can look up your local districts, your local college. What we're working on this year is developing a practice assessment for college leaders, thinking about their particular K-12 partnerships to assess their dual credit practices. So stay tuned. We're going to be sharing about a study that we did and published last year that looked nationally at dual enrollment outcomes. But on the next slide, I just want to start by, in colleges, in post-secondary, we're looking at college enrollments a lot, but I want to just take a step back to think about high school graduates and college going rates. And we know that there's this sort of questioning of the value of college and post-secondary. We know that COVID had a big hit on college enrollments. But when we look just nationally at immediate college going rates, one thing to highlight is that college going rates were dropping even before the pandemic. Of course, they dropped even more. But it sort of had a peak of 69%, that being the immediate college enrollment nationally. But it really went down to 62 most recently. And if you click again, you'll see it's just a large number of students that are not enrolling in college. And if you extrapolate that to the size of the graduating class every year, we're looking at over 1 million students that don't immediately enroll. And some of them will, later on that year, or perhaps in the next year, but it's not that many more. We know that if students don't go right away, that's really their most likely chance to go to college. So this trend in the college going rate really contrasts the trend on the next slide, which is the growing number of high school students who are taking college courses or in dual enrollment across the country. And I should say, just by means of terminology, we'll use the term dual enrollment to speak very broadly to any type of way that a student is taking a college course through a partnership with the post-secondary provider before they complete high school. And we'll just sort of use that dual enrollment term as a broad one here. But what you can see is that just over the last 2 decades, these offerings and their many different modalities and shapes and sizes have really expanded quite a bit nationally. They've doubled in the last 10 years and tripled in the last 20 years. Most of it's happening at community colleges, and it's pretty consistent across states, especially in the Midwest. That the growth has been pretty steady along the way. Of course, in the next slide, we got an official count of the academic year from the college side from IPEDS that from 22-23 that was released just about 6 months ago. First time we ever had this full national perspective, and it's nearly 2.5 million dual enrollments in the 22-23. So this is quite a large program. It's especially large at community colleges, for which it accounts for a fifth of community college students nationally. And in the next slide, what we're showing you is that for every state, if we just look at the community college sector, high school students are making up a large share of who's at community college. In 10 states, it's more than a third of community college students. And you can see there's a couple of states in there, Indiana and Idaho, where it's more than half of their community college students are in high school dual enrollment, which is a result of both the growth of dual enrollment, but also the declines of older working adult students. And, this is, I think, creating a lot of opportunities, especially when you think about that first chart I showed you and the declining college going rates, but it's also creating a lot of growing pains at institutions, as we in higher ed, not always the most agile of organizations in terms of hiring new staff, changing organizational structure, but this is a quickly growing and changing trend in community colleges. So in the next slide, a sort of shift to the topic today is just, what are the benefits to students? And it's just important to say that the growth of high school dual enrollment programs has really been a good thing for students and communities. For decades now, there's been research trying to isolate and identify the effects of taking a dual enrollment course, taking a concurrent enrollment course, taking a dual credit course, taking 2 or 3, taking an early college high school, taking it at the high school, taking it at the college, all these different designs and ways that these programs are implemented. What are the effects of that on finishing high school, going to college, completing in college? And there has been this wealth of evidence, experimental, quasi-experimental studies that have shown that, on net, taking one of these courses does have a benefit, including to students who are underrepresented in higher education. So it really shows to the potential. What we're offering here is to say, okay, we know that on net, these courses have a benefit, but when we just look at the outcomes descriptively, as we'll say, by state and by subgroup, what do we see? And what we see is that there is a variation by state. There's a large variation at the college level. And this sort of, I think, raises interesting questions around, what we know these programs work, but what can we do to help them work better for more students? And as my colleague Tatiana will sort of share, we're seeing that these programs are serving students very well. Students benefit from these programs, but there are differences by state. And in this report, we're offering the sort of state-by-state breakdown for folks by important subgroups of students, really for the first time. So I'll turn it over to Tatiana to walk through the findings from that study.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, John, for the introduction and for providing this context. One of the things about these quasi-experimental and experimental evidence that we've seen is that they are basically, because of the requirements of experimental studies and quasi-experimental studies, they focus on specific context or students who are at the margin of eligibility to participate in dual enrollment. And it's been really hard to get kind of like a national picture divided by state as well, and focusing on a specific groups of interest on what's going on with dual enrollment students. So we really had the opportunity to do that in this specific report. We are not able to address the causal effects, to address the changes in outcomes that are fully attributed to dual enrollment, but rather we're able to provide a national picture on where these students are up to 4 years after their expected high school completion. So that's what we do in this report, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. What we do is that we examine national and state-by-state post-secondary outcomes of dual enrollment students who started in the fall of 2015. So that's relatively far back, but that's also offering us the opportunity to track these students all the way after they complete high school and up to 4 years post their expected high school completion. And so we take data from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center that allow us to do this tracking. We construct these measures of post-secondary outcomes and we analyze them at the national level, but also across states, and with a focus on specific subgroups of students who have been underrepresented over the last few years in post-secondary attainment in general. So today I'm going to show you the national level findings, and so key takeaways from the state-by-state level findings. And I'm also going to show you a data dashboard that we constructed with this data that basically allows people to dig into their own state or a particular state of interest metrics on the post-secondary outcomes of their dual enrollment students. So what we do in this report and how we handle the data, again, we start with the cohort of the high school students who started to take college level coursework for the first time in the fall of 2015. We call these students dual enrollment students, with the purpose of tracking students up to 4 years post-high school completion. We're going to be focusing on the students who started when they were in the 11th and 12th grade of high school, which is basically 88% of the dual enrollment students in our sample. A large chunk of our analysis are going to focus on the outcomes of these dual enrollment students, but also for reference, we're going to look at the post-secondary outcomes of students who didn't take any college coursework prior to their high school completion, and we're calling these students the non-DE students. And we basically focus on 2 different sets of outcomes. The first set of outcomes are related to what happens to them within the first year after high school completion. So basically, we examine whether they enrolled at a post-secondary institution within 1 year post-high school completion, and whether they re-enrolled at the institution where they took their dual enrollment courses within that first year. And then for the somewhat long-term outcomes, we look at what happens to students 4 years after high school completion. And for that, we look basically at whether they completed a bachelor degree, an associate, or a certificate. Some of the things that we don't do in this data, that we don't have available in this data to do, is, for example, distinguish by the type of courses or dual enrollment programs that these students are participating in. So we can only say and distinguish students by whether they were taking some college level coursework prior to high school completion or not. So that's one of the limitations that we have in this data. We aren't able to distinguish, for example, how many courses they took, whether they were taking courses in a specific area or from a specific, field of interest or track of interest. So it's very general in terms of the definition of what we mean by dual enrollment participation. But again, the richness of the data comes from being able to provide this national level picture for all students by states and for specific subgroups of students. So let me start by speaking about what happens to this group of students that we're calling the dual enrollment students. So these are high school students who were taking college level coursework prior to high school completion. What we find, first of all, is that about 81% of these dual enrollment students were enrolled at a post-secondary institution within 1 year from high school completion. Basically, what that means is that 4 in every 5 dual enrollment students went directly to college after high school. And of those, half of the dual enrollment students went directly to a 4-year institution. And 42% of these dual enrollment students completed a credential within 4 years after high school completion. That being 25% completed a bachelor's, 10% completed an associate's, and 2% completed a certificate. Again, this is relative to all these students who we observed taking college level courses while in high school. And when we examine the variation in these completion rates across states, we find that the post-secondary outcomes of these students in terms of degree completion were particularly strong in 5 states: Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, and New Jersey. But one thing that we emphasize a lot in the report, and that we also want to emphasize today in this presentation, is that because of the wide differences in how dual enrollment is implemented in terms of who gets access to dual enrollment, how access and eligibility for dual enrollment courses is defined, how dual enrollment courses are financed, by whom, basically who's paying for these courses, differences in implementation across states, it's not, I would say, fair to speak about rankings across the states, of states doing better than others, but rather this is more for providing points of references of what's the distribution and the outcomes of dual enrollment students nationwide. Another thing to highlight from this report, and this is more like a technical figure that I want to highlight for you, but that you can find in the report as well, is that when we distinguish students depending on whether they were taking their dual enrollment courses at a community college or at a 4-year institution, what we observe is that in general, students who took their dual enrollment courses at a 4-year institution tend to do slightly better. But in general, of course, there is a lot of selection and differences in the students who are taking dual enrollment courses at a 4-year institution as opposed to a community college. So you see that there is this big gap in post-secondary enrollment at 4-year institutions. So basically, students who take their dual enrollment courses at 4-year institutions are, of course, much more likely to go to a 4-year institution and to complete complete bachelor degrees 4 years after at a much higher rate. So that's kind of thinking about dual enrollment students in general. If you think about it, from example, from the perspective of a high school institution who's basically looking at their pool of students who are taking dual enrollment courses and trying to understand what their outcomes are. that perspective is kind of offered by these previous stats that I showed you. But another thing that we also do in this report is that we try to construct a comparison between the dual enrollment students and the non-dual enrollment students. And the way how we do that is we constrain to all students who we observed enroll around 1 year post-high school. So this is 1 year post-high school for the students that we observe are dual enrollment students. And for the non-dual enrollment students, these are students who are between 18 to 20 years old. And we looked at what happens to them 4 years after. And when we do this exercise, we see that students who took dual enrollment courses in high school have higher degree completion rates than students who didn't. That these non-dual enrollment students, these young non-dual enrollment students, their completion rate is slightly lower. We also see a lot of variation in this gap between dual enrollment and non-dual enrollment completion rates across states. But in general, in 41 states, dual enrollment is associated with a higher completion rate 4 years after high school. And in 16 states, dual enrollment students showed a double-digit difference in terms of the completion rate relative to non-dual enrollment students. Again, large differences and large variation in terms of the characteristics and the policies and the, in general, dual enrollment courses experiences across states. So not causal, but again, good points of reference in terms of understanding the gaps between groups of students. And another thing that we do in our analysis is we are able to look at these like national trends in terms of how these dual enrollment students do compared to non-dual enrollment students, but we are also able to distinguish the completion rates among specific subgroups of students, like low-income students, Black and Hispanic students in particular. And when we do this analysis, what we find, if you look here, these are the bachelor completion rates within 4 years for dual enrollment students compared to non-dual enrollment students. And so this is the initial gap that I was mentioning before for bachelor completion only. And what we see is that at the national level, the difference in bachelor completion rate at the very least between dual enrollment students and non-dual enrollment students isn't as large. But when you narrow it down among low-income students, Black students, and Hispanic students, you see that these gaps in bachelor completion rates between dual enrollees and non-dual enrollees increase quite a lot, by 8 percentage points in the case of low-income students, by 11 percentage points in the case of Black students. And so on one hand, it seems that there is an association between participating in dual enrollment and improving outcomes, specifically among these underrepresented groups of students, among bachelor completers. But one thing that does persist is that if you focus for a second on like the dark blue bar, and you compare the bachelor completion rate of dual enrollment low-income Black and Hispanic students to the national average dual enrollment completion rate, you see that there are gaps in outcomes that persist among low-income Black and Hispanic students. So in other words, it seems that dual enrollment is associated with improvement in outcomes for these groups of students. However, gaps remain when compared to national averages, with these groups still falling a little bit behind in terms of bachelor completion rates. So this is kind of like the national level picture in outcomes. Now I'm gonna provide a little bit of a framework, and I'm gonna give you kind of like tools to understanding the state-by-state level findings for specific subgroups of students, like Black and Hispanic students. Because one of the things that we do in this report and that you can see in the dashboard is that we can basically assess the rate of award completion within 4 years for the dual enrollment students. And you could basically sort states by that dimension and do it for the national level findings, but also for the specific subgroups of students. So for example, if you do that for the degree completion rate of Black dual enrollee students, what you find is that there are some states who seem to be at the top of this award completion rate compared to other states and to the national average. Like, for example, the bachelor completion rate of Black dual enrollee students is the highest in Florida, New York, Texas. But here comes again my point about how dual enrollment is implemented, what the access to dual enrollment looks like across state, and in general, just representation in dual enrollment of these different subgroups of students. And so to assess that, one thing that we do in this report is that we rely on secondary data from the civil rights data collection to try to assess the Black student representation in dual enrollment compared to the composition of the high schools in that state for that year. And so that's basically giving us a measure of, like, to interpret these findings in context, like, okay, how much access do Black high school students have to dual enrollment in general in this state? And when we do that, what we see is that for some of these states that we see at the top, in terms of like these attainment metrics for dual enrollment students, for Black dual enrollment students, the representation of Black students among dual enrollees in high school is relatively low. So this is the percentage of high school students, is the light blue bar, and this is the percentage of Black dual enrollment students. In other words, and kind of like to summarize this, what we see, for example, in the case of Black students, is that they are severely underrepresented among dual enrollees. And in over half of the states, Black dual enrollment students in post-secondary institutions were enrolling at higher rates than the national average. So definitely there's a tension between access to dual enrollment and the outcomes of these students. And this tension becomes even more clearer when you look at what happens to Hispanic students. What we see is that for Hispanic students, they are basically underrepresented in dual enrollment essentially in every state. But what we see is that in some states, dual enrollment students who are Hispanic have much stronger outcomes than in other states. And one good example for this would be Ohio, Texas, and California. You see that these two bars are relatively close to one another, suggesting that there is a good representation of Hispanic students in dual enrollment relative to the high school composition, and their outcomes continue to be relatively large. So again, this constant tension in terms of who gets access to dual enrollment and what their outcomes look like 4 years after. Now, one last finding that we have in this report and that I want to highlight today is one of the critical indicators and concerns regarding the transition from high school to college is the extent to which dual enrollment students continue enrolled as post-secondary students at the institution where they took their dual enrollment courses, what we can call the re-enrollment rate or the yield rate of these dual enrollment students at the post-secondary institutions. And we are actually able to capture that with this data because we are able to see whether students continued to be enrolled at the same institution where they were taking these courses. And we develop a couple of different metrics to assess the extent to which dual enrollment students re-enrolled at the institutions where they took these courses. Regardless of the metric, what we find is that about a third of the dual enrollment students re-enrolled at the institution where they took their dual enrollment courses within 1 year post-high school. There is variation in terms of along the student characteristics dimension, and also depending on how strict we are with the re-enrollment rate. We could also, like in the figure here to your right, what we look is students who enrolled for 2 consecutive terms. And when we do that, this re-enrollment rate is slightly lower, but still, it's a very significant share of students that go back to their post-secondary institution. Okay, so this has been kind of like this is how the data looks like. These are the methods that we applied, and these are like the national level references for you to keep in mind, and like a framework to how to interpret the data. But one of the things that will certainly be helpful for you when looking into this data and when interpreting your own findings for a given state of interest is to go into the data dashboard that we published alongside this report. So this data dashboard lives on the CCRC website, and you can find it right next to the report. Basically, what we did here is we calculated all of these metrics for all states, all students and subgroups of students, and we fed it into a data dashboard. In this data dashboard, you can filter by state. So let's choose one state here. I'm gonna go with Ohio. And you can see how these metrics look like. In this case, for example, for the state of Ohio, we kind of like the default is to have the metric for all students in the state and for low-income students as well. But you can filter that here. Here. For simplicity, I'm gonna just do that and compare it to the national average. And so, for example, in this first visualization, we're just looking at the outcomes of all students who started their dual enrollment coursework in the fall of 2015 in the state of Ohio. We go and document what their enrollment metrics are within 1 year after high school, and then we present the same 4 years after high school. We present some breakdowns in terms of the shares of students and whether they were enrolled at a four-year institution or at a community college, based on the characteristics that we get to observe. You can break this down by sector as well. For example, if you want to look at the dual enrollment students at community colleges or not, and you can break that by gender as well. You can do comparisons of these metrics along across different states as well. And in here we provide, for example, what's the number of dual enrollment students that we're using for a given calculation based on the data that we received from the National Student Clearinghouse Research Center. And in this tab, we are doing this like side-to-side by comparison that you saw me do in the presentation. So this is basically comparing dual enrollment students against students who didn't have any prior dual enrollment courses. We're also presenting some descriptive statistics regarding the composition of these students by race, but you can do the same by neighborhood income and by gender. And something that we didn't get, that we invite you to kind of like dig into this deeper in the dashboard, is among the dual enrollment students who completed a bachelor's, which bachelor completion field, at which program field they are earning their degree in. We do that for all students, and in comparison to students who didn't have any prior dual enrollment and also completed a bachelor's degree. The first step will provide you a run through the concepts and key definitions that you'll need to work through if you want to dig into this. But basically, yeah, we really invite you to look into this data much deeper and to come up and reach out if you have any questions or if you can help with anything. I'm just gonna go back to the presentation.
Thank you.
1 second.
Are we ready for questions?
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, so I've noticed that we've got 4 questions in Q&A and a bunch of questions in the chat. So, and John's been doing a great job of trying to address the questions in the chat. But if you do have additional questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. It's a little bit easier for us to keep track of them there. So let's get started. And some of these might have been already answered in the chat and in other places and in writing, but we want to make sure everyone gets a chance to hear them. So first of all, does college include technical/vocational colleges or just community colleges, this data? And does the data also include dual enrollment at universities?
Yeah, so certainly for the second one, that's one of the key dimensions that we consider, whether they enroll at a four-year institution, and that's something that you can kind of like split and dissect in the data dashboard. We present some statistics for that, but not a lot in the report as well. So yes, certainly, and one of the key findings from that is that The dual enrollment students who took their dual enrollment courses at four-year institutions have higher enrollment rates at four-year institutions and have much higher bachelor completion rates 4 years after. As to the technical colleges, I think we have kind of a mix, right, John? It's mostly community colleges.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's sort of like the definition of community colleges. It's like more, it's trickier than you might think, because if you just go with like the 2-year institutions, there's like over 100 that offer a bachelor's degree, so they're technically considered 4 years. So we go round and round with this with like AACC all the time, and we've written about like what are the implications for these different definitions, but we tend to kind of go with like kind of state defined or state supported community colleges. Like state agencies often have their own definitions, and so we try to mimic that. But it's about 1,000 colleges, including many technical colleges.
Great, thank you. All right, here's another one. The definitions on slide 11 use the same definition for what they consider a dual enrollment student and non-DE. For non-DE, do they mean post-high school graduation they enrolled?
Let me see. So what we mean for non-DE is of the students that we observed starting in the fall of 2015, which students don't have any prior enrollment. That's what we call first time ever at a post-secondary institution, right? That's what we mean by that.
Great, thank you. I love this research. Do you have any research you're excited about later in the year? We would love a teaser and to hear about that.
John, what do you say?
Well, I'll let you, we have something that we have like a lot of things we're very excited about. I'll let Tati talk about the one that I know she's excited about, but I'll also just say on the last question about like the comparison to the non-dual enrollment, Tati mentioned this, this is just a simple descriptive finding. Like we're not controlling for any student background characteristics or really anything. So I think you have to sort of go into this thinking like you would expect that students with dual enrollment that are going to college are going to complete at higher rates than students that are starting with no prior dual enrollment, just based on what we know from the literature. And indeed, that is the case nationally and in most states. And so I think we're not trying to make a claim here about the effect of dual enrollment. What we're trying to do is show you, like in your state, what is that difference for all students or for low-income students, so that you can kind of use that just something that we haven't seen before nationally in the state context. But it is important to have that caveat that this is it's capturing the momentum of the dual enrollment credits, but it's also capturing other things about students who sort of opt into dual enrollment. And so anyway, so just wanted to add on that from the chat.
And what about
research?
Yeah, what are we excited about this year that sort of builds on this work, Tati?
Well, John, thank you for asking, and thank you for the person in the audience to ask. We are currently working on one project mainly that kind of builds on this question. There are two things about the participation in dual enrollment that are sort of critical at this point in the literature and at this point of the policy expansion to understand. One is, of course, what happens to dual enrollment students after high school, not only in terms of their post-secondary outcomes, but also in terms of their labor market trajectories and outcomes, namely earning. And so one of the things that we're doing is to characterize that. But most importantly, and like on top of that question, which is important, but it's already kind of like started to be addressed in the literature by different researchers, is to understand the differences in dual enrollment course taking patterns and experiences, right? Like we know that these are kind of like very I want to say like low bar-ish definitions in terms of what dual enrollment student is or is not. So basically, did you enroll at a college to take a college level course? It doesn't really speak about the type of courses that you took, the amount of credits that you took, in general, the intensity of those courses, but also the types of courses that you took. Are you taking only these courses, or are you also attempting CTE courses or APAB courses, which are also complementary to this college and acceleration programs that basically foster the transition to post-secondary and to labor market success? And so what we're doing is to use data from the state of Texas to construct this different course taking profiles among dual enrollees and use those to examine how the students who are into these different course taking profiles are different from one another, right? Like kind of like to understand who's taking what on dual enrollment and how do they combine these courses, and then to map their post-secondary trajectories afterwards. Basically understand where are they going up to 6 years post high school in terms of their post-secondary outcomes, but also in terms of their earnings. We are hoping that this research is going to be out by the fall at some point, hopefully, fingers crossed. So that's one of the projects that we are really excited about for this year, at the very least.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think the study like this one that we're doing, you know, it tends to look at dual enrollment just as like one thing, you know, you took a dual enrollment course or not. And I think trying to get more into, you know, what type of dual enrollment, but also what else are students taking in high school. And I think it's really motivated, again, by another applied research project that we're getting going to better understand, you know, what does it look like when dual enrollment is integrated and aligned with the typical high school experience, which are students who want to go to university and get a bachelor's, and also students who are in like CTE, high school CTE programs. And one of the sort of national statistics that really motivates this work is that among all high school graduates, like a third have taken some dual enrollment, but there's a whole other third of high school graduates that haven't taken a dual enrollment course, but have concentrated in a secondary CTE program. And in some of our fieldwork, we just saw some really cool, innovative stuff happening to build in as a default course some dual enrollment related to the CTE area that high school students were interested in. And we thought that that's really interesting and exciting. We want to sort of describe it at the state level, like in Texas, like what is that sort of value add of layering in dual credit on top of your secondary CTE program in terms of your job prospects and earnings, but then also to study it, doing more field work to see what does it look like, what are the barriers, why it hasn't happened more, and how are folks like resolving and getting past that.
Great. Well, those are both exciting. Thank you for sharing that with us. All right, next question. Do you have a benchmark for how many non-DE students went directly to college after high school as compared to the 4 in every 5, 81% of DE students who went directly?
Yeah, so we have some data from the National Center of Education Statistics saying, I'm not exactly sure about the cohort year, John, I think it's 2017. I'm not sure, but it's like a relatively close high school cohort as well, high school completion cohort as well. And it says that all those students from that cohort, 70% went to college within that year. But this is including dual enrollment students. So it's like a overestimated average because it's pulled up
that 81%,
by the dual enrollment students who are in that account. So even if you take just the national average, when you focus only on the dual enrollment students, there seems to be roughly a 10 percentage point difference between the two groups.
Yeah, and you saw the first slides I shared was like the national college going rate, which is, a sample, but it's, it's 62. That's who go to the first fall. That's immediate college enrollment. And we were looking at over the first year. So basically there's not like a great, there's not like a comparison nationally. We can kind of estimate it. Maybe it's 70, it's a little bit more than 62, but I think probably what we were trying to do too is show this by state, because states oftentimes report this much more in detail. So you can kind of see what it is for your state and kind of know what that comparison number. I was just in Colorado making a presentation, and I found some of their statewide data, and it's only half of their high school graduates are going to college. So I think that college going rate is a really important motivator in terms of the potential of dual enrollment, and to think about broadening the benefits of dual enrollment. Instead of fighting over kind of who's going to university versus coming back to our college, think about all the students that just aren't going to any college. That's really where the greatest potential is.
Great. Thank you. Are you planning on diving more into access issues and the other barriers that prevent students from being a dual enrollment student?
Yeah, I will say we're definitely very focused on researching how to broaden access, and our DEEP framework tackles that both by thinking about access to college and dual enrollment courses, but access to courses that are high quality with the right supports to make sure students are successful and align to college degree programs and pathways in fields of interest to students and of importance to local communities. So it's sort of not just that access for who, but access to what question that we try to address in our deep research. And what we're presenting is quantitative research describing these outcomes. We're doing more of this, building data tools with national data where you're going to be able to look up your local district and high schools and see sort of what are the gaps in access. But we're also studying it qualitatively in fieldwork, where we visited sites that have closed gaps in access by race and income, and just seeing like what have they done. And we have a set of sort of tactics, playbooks, recommendations around that. Covering like how are folks addressing issues around if there's a hard eligibility requirement around testing, shifting away from testing or working within those testing regimes to do boot camps and get folks through the tests, and addressing issues, logistics, transportation, and instructor sort of supply issues. So I think there's a range of challenges depending on how these programs are implemented. We've been a part of trying to describe what are some ways to address those in our dual enrollment playbook and in our deep insights field guide.
Thank you. I'm not able to see the entire chat, but I'm wondering if Mary or Carrie with us today from MHEC could share the links to those playbooks in that framework so that people can take a look at them that way. Oh, you got them. All right, there we go. You beat us to it. Thank you. All right, another question. Do you have any best practices you can share with practitioners or areas of improvement that you came across as you were working on this research? And I'm guessing they should go to the deep framework and look at those things, right? That's going to be the best place for them to look.
Yeah, I would say, well, first, in terms of like data usage, like one thing I would offer is just to like use your clearinghouse data to look at what's happening to your own dual enrollment students after high school. If you're at a college or a state or even a high school, there is just this National Student Clearinghouse data. Probably somebody has it at your institution or state. You kind of have to ask around. And it's really powerful because it's first comprehensive. They have almost 100% coverage on if a student goes to college, where do they show up, which college, what's their major at that college, and then if they complete, which college are they completing at and what degree did they complete, including the field of study. And it's so powerful to tell the story of what happens to your students after high school, how many come back to our institution, how many complete a bachelor's in the STEM fields, what are the top majors they're enrolling in. Maybe we should try to design our programs based on like what our students are telling us they want to major in after high school. So there's a lot to sort of unpack there. And indeed, something we're working on is like tools and ways to help folks at colleges and in states better use their clearinghouse data, because it's not always, it's in this like database format in a long CSV. And so we're working on that. But I think that's a recommendation from the data perspective. We have a whole set of more practice-based recommendations around how to broaden access by expanding your outreach efforts to Title I high schools or underserved high schools, building partnerships to and getting the word out to communities. In 26 states, this is free college, and you'd be shocked at how many folks just don't know about it. So the sort of awareness building, addressing the eligibility issues, ensuring that the courses that you offered are aligned to degree programs and transfer pathways, and providing college advising for students, especially if they're hitting like 15 credits and they haven't talked to a college advisor. We can't expect the school counselors to know degree plan, transfer, and applicability requirements. So advising, and then of course in the instruction, I think NACEP is a great organization in terms of ensuring quality standards in these courses. So when we broaden access, it's not about lowering the standards, it's about increasing the supports. So keeping the standards high, but then doing all sorts of things to front load supports, normalize the difficulty of these courses and promote help-seeking behavior, and then provide those resources to students. And those are some of the things that we describe in this deep insights sort of framework. And then we have a whole other set of guidance that I'll share the link in about if that's what practitioners are trying to do, what then can systems and state agencies do to sort of support, ideally and definitely get out of the way of that excellent practice happening?
Thank you. All right, moving on to another question. The state of Indiana is diving deep into the expansion of apprenticeships into the K-12 level. Given Indiana's high level of dual enrollment, how do you see these policy initiatives intertwining?
I'm not super familiar with what's going on in Indiana. So this is some of these things would be like, well, what do you all think? We kind of put it back to you. Indiana does stand out in terms of just the size and scope and investment that the state's made. From what I gather, there's real strong incentives both for K-12s and colleges to expand these programs, and a real effort around alignment and statewide coordination to support alignment to the college degree and transfer pathways that they've done. I think part of this question is about that sort of work-based learning or internships, apprenticeships. And I think that's another, I think of that in the sort of bucket of like quality coursework. There's things like that happen outside of courses, but then you think about like what makes a good college course. It's applied and experiential learning and sort of connection to students' interests, and contextualization. And I think that the sort of work-based learning and apprenticeships can be hard to scale outside of a classroom setting, although they're very important and beneficial, don't get me wrong. But if we're thinking about like how to do it for the hundreds of thousands of students, I think too, there must be an element that's happening in the classroom. But that's sort of my 2 cents. And I don't know too much about what's going on in Indiana, but definitely welcome other thoughts on that.
Thank you. Here's a question. Have you thought of, or are you planning any research that will provide a comparison between dual enrollment engagement and results and high school AP or IB offerings and engagement and results?
Yeah, I can answer that. Part of the like a fundamental part of the work that we're going to be doing with the state of Texas is to examine these post-secondary outcomes and trajectories for dual enrollment students in comparison to students who took no dual enrollment courses but took AP/IB courses, or no dual enrollment courses but CTE courses. That's another comparison group. And with dual enrollment students who took AP courses, AP/IB courses as well. So basically like trying to understand the differences or how dual enrollment is contributing to these trajectory differences among students taking AP/IB courses. So it's not necessarily like about the access to these courses, but rather among the students who accessed these courses, how do they do afterwards and how their trajectories differ depending on whether they took AP/IB or not.
Yeah,
Right.
I would add too, when we just try to think about like high school graduates as a whole, there's a lot of students taking AP in many states. There's a lot of students taking dual enrollment. There's a good number doing both. Students doing both have like incredibly strong post-secondary outcomes. They're really kind of your high flyers. I think framing it that way though is important, because then you're like, well, how many students are not doing either of those? And how do we kind of work on sort of eating into that group? And when I've looked at this in some states, and it's like, can be almost the majority, if not the majority of students aren't getting access to any of these accelerated courses. And so I think that, that's where I think where we're trying to go with this research we talked about in Texas, is thinking about how do you broaden access to any of these opportunities for more students. And on the connection to students' experiences themselves, one thing that's really cool that's sort of underway in the field is that the Center for Community College Student Engagement, CCRC, which for many years has worked with community colleges to survey their students and understand their students' experiences, has created a dual enrollment survey of student experience that's piloted a couple rounds, and now they're kind of gearing up to scale this up to be a measure of like what are our dual enrollment students' experiences, to what extent are they utilizing our services, how are they thinking about their motivations for taking these courses. And I would just, for folks, especially who are at colleges, keep an eye out for that as an opportunity to survey and better understand your dual enrollment students with some like benchmarks to other colleges in the field.
Great. All right. Slide 6 references iPad's data as age 17 or younger, but this slide is grade specific for identifying DE students, and it's related to another question that says DE data is limited to 17-year-olds as of what date? Date range specific date?
Yeah, let's talk about age and dual enrollment identification thoughts, Tatiana.
I just want to make sure if this is the slide 6 that we're talking about, but yeah, so one of the things that we've been actually thinking about a lot when measuring dual enrollment participation is how to define it, and the role that age plays on that. So for example, before having this really great data by iPads looking at the actual headcounts of dual enrollment students, what we used to do with the iPads data was to look at the students who were under 18 years old by the time that they were enrolled at a post-secondary institution, and then kind of like call them dual enrollment students. This is, of course, kind of like a quantitative decision that we make in terms of like assessing who are these dual enrollment students for the iPads data. One of the exercises that we got to do with the NSC data, at least partially, was to assess the extent to which, or kind of like how far off we were when we were basically like saying, defining dual enrollment students only by age, as opposed to using age and high school completion. And one of the things that we found doing that exercise, I think that in the report, it's kind of like reference on a footnote at the end, but we actually spent a lot of time doing that exercise, is that there isn't much of a difference in terms of measurement error. So basically looking at the students who are under 18 years old by the time that they're enrolled is pretty reliable as a metric. This of course changes a lot depending on the states, because in some states the age when you are supposed to start school changes a little bit, and that can translate into differences in the age that you have when you complete high school. But in general, it's a very reliable metric. Right now, we are working with an awesome group of graduate PhD students who are looking into this issue in detail. Our findings so far seem to suggest that this age metric continues to be reliable. John, do you want to add anything else on
I would just
that?
add that this is it's an important measurement question that seems kind of nerdy, but is important because of a slide like this, where like the only thing historically we can see is based on age, but we don't actually know how good or bad age is, or like what's that error rate of measuring dual enrollment status by age. Tati shared we did a lot of work with the clearinghouse data and showed that it's pretty good. But one thing we're working on now is looking like for states that have like publicly reported college level data on how many dual enrollment students there are. Like Texas is one that just posted all online. Then we're comparing that against iPads historically to look at like error rates. And if you are in a state that has this information available publicly, you know, where it shows for each college, like how many dual enrollment students there were in fall of 2017, for instance, please reach out to us. We'd love to get more sort of data into this validation measurement exercise. You'll be a part of the nerdiest of groups of dual enrollment researchers.
Yes, please, that would be fantastic. We are really trying to get as many publicly available data as available into this exercise, but of course we don't know all the data that's out there. So if you know of data that's publicly available in your state and that we can easily download from a given website, that would be fantastic.
All right, I think I've got one more question here. You may have covered this, but does dual enrollment mean they were registered in a dual enrollment course or completed and earned a credit?
Oh yeah, I think I addressed that question in the chat. So this is basically whether they are enrolled. We cannot tell whether they earned the credit or they passed the class. We cannot tell how many classes they took. It's basically whether they show that as enrolled, which you could interpret it as whether they attempted to take dual credit or not, basically.
All right. Well, I wish I could answer all the questions. There are a lot of them posed and answered in the chat, which we can share with you. And we will, this will not be the last time, obviously, that we work with John and Tatiana and feature their work. But I did want to just do a little bit of housekeeping here at the end. We do have another webinar coming up soon, and you'll receive all that information in the follow-up email. Plus, if you take our dual enrollment newsletter, it's featured there, and we're going to be doing these about once a month, and they're all about research and data. So please do look for that next webinar. I think Mary can probably put some of that information in the chat. I will say that MHEC is working on a report on an overview of the state data available for dual enrollment. So sometime in this year, you're gonna be able to look at that report and see what the data are that you can use to understand and put these data into perspective. And then I will just let you know, for some of you, we will be reaching out. We are having a dual enrollment state policy workshop this summer that MHEC is sponsoring and hosting, so that so people get to take a look at the data and some different elements of policy and practice, and have a day or two just to think about, what am I seeing here? What could be improved? So, John, Tatiana, thank you so much. This has clearly been worthwhile to folks, so we'll have to follow up and do another one. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us,
care.
and thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.